Everyone is a star child, made of stardust and the infinite potential of the universe. This extraordinary fearless something in each of us clamors for freedom from the bonds of fear, conformity, and an ordinary life. Welcome to Dr. Durr's Living in the Sweet Spot, where practical tools and solutions from the intersection of mind-body medicine, science, and spiritual well-being awaken and empower you to live out your infinite potential, to live life in the sweet spot. Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Dr. Balin Durr, welcoming you to Living in the Sweet Spot. Today, we are going to talk about something that actually, frankly, affects millions, both the person involved plus their families. So if you have a child that struggles with attention, with being hyperactive, impulsive, or other ADHD symptoms, you know how challenging that can be, again, both for the child and for the family. And if you're talking about adults, for their partners, for their employers, and in their relationships. So today, I am going to welcome my guest, Dr. Connie McReynolds. Hello there, Dr. McReynolds.
Hello. It's so nice to be here.
What? And excuse me for that. I'm so happy and excited to kind of have this conversation with you today, particularly about this topic. And so we're going to talk about your new book, Solving the ADHD Riddles, right? The real causes and lasting solutions of your child's struggles to learn. Mm-hmm. So excuse me, my excitement about that. I couldn't get my words out. So, but yeah, so thank you so much for joining me today.
No, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to this very much today.
Yeah, so you have a different understanding about ADHD in terms of its causes and therefore its solutions. So how about if we start off with talking about what ADHD looks like, right?
Yes, because I think that is a very good place to begin. And it's so interesting because people, pardon me, have different ideas about what ADHD is, kind of depending on your point of view, I guess, your worldview of this. Some people think it's just a willfully bad behaving child. And you can see that kind of out in the public. You can see a child who maybe isn't doing what a parent wants, or maybe they're running around the room, or they're in the grocery store and they're making a lot of noise and acting out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's certainly the behaviors, I think, that we anchor in on. When we think about a child who has ADHD, a lot of times we hear people talk about this is the child who can't sit still. This is the child that's just motoring around all the time and always into something, bumping things over, knocking things over, doing something, and having to be redirected all the time. And that redirection doesn't necessarily yield a different outcome. So people get really frustrated with a lot of these children. But there's really other children who are quieter that might go undetected with this. And that's really the focus of what my work has been, is kind of peeling back what we understand ADHD to be, to maybe look at this from a different perspective and a little deeper. We kind of dive into this to see what maybe there's something else going on here.
Yeah. So the other thing I thought about as you talked about that, and then of course, as these children age and those difficulties that then occur in their adult relationships, then they get called, the bad boyfriend or the bad girlfriend, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
right, because they have such difficulty functioning, in their relationships. So
yes, or the bad employee. The employee who doesn't follow through, can't hold on to anything, loses things, and doesn't, seem to remember. It goes in one ear and out the other. So we've got all kinds of descriptors for folks that fall into this category.
Yes, 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 ma'am. So, absolutely right, and don't forget about that bad driver,
Yes, actually.
right? Yeah, the bad driver. So, before we get into this a little further, let's talk about what you do, right? So
Mm,
you are a licensed psychologist and a certified rehabilitation counselor with more than 30 years of experience in the field of rehabilitation counseling and psychology. And
mhm,
you've also been the founder of some prominent neurofeedback clinics in Southern California, which is definitely what we're going to talk some more about that, right? And then, of course, you
mhm,
specialize in working with adults and children, and
mhm.
from 5 to 90. Wow, that's a big range, right?
It is.
Although,
It is.
although and I tell folks, I said one of the things you need to remember is in terms of why we get frustrated with adults is because sometimes even though they're adult bodies, they actually have the mind and the emotions of children walking
Mhm.
around in those adult bodies doing children-like things, doing
Right.
childlike things, engaging in those kinds of behaviors, but we're expecting more mature behaviors.
Mhm.
So you specialize in ADHD, depression, pain management, um, I should say chronic pain,
Mhm.
and any other specialties that you do?
Well, certainly trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder is a big one that we tackle. The anxiety and depression, as you know, kind of travel together.
Mhm.
Chronic
And
pain can,
along with the ADHD, right? They occur in a
yeah,
much higher frequency together.
they really do. And why we don't necessarily know, but they seem to be there. And so, yes, there's a host of conditions, other ones for children that have walked in the door, these diagnoses, and I mean the labels that have come in include intermittent explosive disorder,
Mhm,
includes kind of anger management problems. So we have children who are described as having a lot of tantrums.
mhm,
So they can have meltdowns, some people call them.
mhm.
Um, Grandmother called them a cataclysmic event
Oh,
because of
yeah.
the impact that
Yeah,
it
I
can
read
have.
that story about was she 5, the little girl? Her granddaughter was 5? Yeah,
Yes,
and you talk about that in your book.
yes, yes. So it can have a big impact, not only in this child's life, but any adult who's really trying to work with a child who's struggling like this. Everyone is affected. So
Mhm,
it can be, walking down a grocery store aisle. If you're sensitive to sounds and you've got a child who is really kind of acting out and running around, or if you're unsteady on your feet, this child goes racing by, you can get a little scared or frightened, about what's going on, and you can worry about that. So it's pretty broad based, actually.
yeah, and actually, when you told that story, it actually reminds me of an occasion when I was in the store and I had a family member with me, and he was a toddler, frankly.
Mhm,
And I paid for the items, had this big old shopping cart full of stuff, and had the receipt. And I said, I want to need to keep up with the receipt because the store I was at, they check the receipt before you leave.
mhm, mhm,
And the toddler took off, and I threw the receipt down somewhere. I thought it was in the cart, but when I caught up with him and then went to find the receipt, I was in the store probably another 30 minutes to an hour, frankly, trying to, because I was like, I am not leaving my milk that I paid for.
no,
So, but I was so frustrated, not with
mhm,
not with a toddler, right? But the store and that whole thing. So when you talk about, kids taking off,
yeah,
it made me think of that. So
mhm,
so it also things, I think too, for the audience, it should help to define, if we define the types of ADHD, right? There's
yes,
ADHD inattentive, there's
mhm,
ADHD hyperactive/impulsive type. And then the third type is the combined type, which is a combination of inattentive and
mhm.
plus hyperactive and impulsive. And so, of course, you kind of talked about, some of those, which are largely the behaviors you talked about fall more in line with the hyperactive impulsive type, right?
Yes, I think, and that I think is the one people are probably most familiar with, is that you think about this child who's really physically misbehaving, the child in the classroom who can't sit in the seat, is up and down and all over the place. And so that's really the hyperactive
Yeah.
piece.
Touching things, moving things, breaking things.
Breaking things, tripping things, all kinds of things going on.
Right.
Yeah, it's kind of a train wreck that follows some of these children. You can see a trail sometimes with
Mm-hmm.
some of them as they come in a house. They'll start dropping things, or they start, everything just doesn't quite fit together the way you want it to. And so people can get really frustrated with that if you're living with that day in and day out, 24/7. And parents are busy. Most parents work, and there could be other siblings in the household. Maybe they all behave,
Mm-hmm.
so to speak, and you have one that somehow is different from the rest. And then, of course, that's a whole story that
Yeah.
gets started as well.
Yeah. So what does the inattentive type look like?
Well, this I kind of describe as the daydreamer. So this is going to be the child that you're talking to, and they just kind of drift off and just are looking around. And it's like, are you paying attention to me? Oh, yeah. And then they're just kind of moseying around, not quite in tune with what's coming along. So you actually get that going on, and people will say it just goes in one ear and out the other. And in some cases, it's really is what's happening.
Yeah, so they're having difficulty focusing and paying attention, like you said, and staying on task, and I had an appointment, I forgot.
Yeah. Forgot the homework. This is the one I hear all the time. Forgot the homework. Forgot to bring it home. Forgot to take it in.
Oh, but here's the best one to me. I did it, but I forgot to turn it in.
Oh yeah, that one will drive parents and teachers over the edge quicker than anything, particularly if they stayed up until 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night the night before getting it all done. And then there are no points because it didn't make it to the school, to the teacher.
Right.
And so these are, yeah.
Or I paid a tutor. I have a
Mm-hmm.
tutor,
Oh,
paying a tutor to help you do this. It was done.
where
It
is
was
it?
done last
They,
night. I know it was done. You did it with the tutor. I saw it. But now where is it?
where is it? Don't have any idea. It might as well have just been vaporized because it has just gone missing.
I might as well take my money and bought a pair of shoes
Yes.
instead of
Yeah.
spending it on the tutor.
There's just so many stories. I've been doing this for 15 years, and there's a theme to some, but there's a uniqueness, of course, to each child and each adult that's dealing with this, is kind of how they are being affected in their life. And the bottom line is usually stress. Underneath all of this is stress. There's frustration, irritation, and honestly, just in a child's point of view, they start kind of doing a lot of negative self-talk, and so they kind of start saying that they're not smart, and so they'll use words like that to describe themselves. I've even had adults do that.
Mm-hmm.
That just I obviously am not as smart as so and so is because I haven't been able to figure this out, and it isn't an issue of intelligence. It's what I have come to understand, and that's really where the hope and the change in the narrative kind of comes in the door.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say, for me, to be honest, it's really heartbreaking when I hear a child say I'm stupid,
Mhm.
because they don't understand that their brain just works in a different way
Mhm.
than some other folks' brains work, and that it doesn't make, like you said, doesn't make them less intelligent. It just means we got to figure out what's going to work for them, um, based upon the way their brain works.
Mhm. Yes, that's absolutely true. And it's so important for parents. And a lot of parents have really tried to figure it out. So I want to be really
Mhm.
clear. There are a lot of parents who they'll walk in and we start talking, and they'll just kind of naturally say, well, we do this. And we know that, if we say go do two or three things, it isn't going to happen. So we can only do one thing,
Mhm.
or we have to repeat it a lot in order to get this accomplished, or we have to just ride herd on the backpack and the homework and getting from point A of home to point B at school. So parents really have a lot of times tried a lot of different avenues to get resolution, and it just isn't lasting resolution for them. It's like a day in, a day out kind of thing, 24/7 sometimes.
Yeah, and there's like you said, they may start an assignment or start a task and don't finish it, or you know, um, they go, you send them to the store and they get part of what you wanted for them to get to the store because they forgot or they got distracted, or things like that. So these have real consequences
Mhm.
for folks if they're, say for instance, if they want to seek some higher level of education, or maybe if they're also an athlete, they got to maintain a certain GPA.
Mhm.
So this can be really impactful for their future.
Mhm. Mhm.
So and it's so why I think it's so important. So what are we actually talking about in terms of the numbers of folks that are affected by
Mhm.
this, along with the fact that people, some people feel like it's our diagnosis of it is increasing. Some folks feel like it's overdiagnosed.
Mhm.
So what are we talking about here?
Well, the numbers are really kind of staggering when you think about the children that have been diagnosed. In this country, I think it's honestly a conservative number, which they talk about 6 to 7 million children. I think there are a lot more children with these things going on that are really not identified, particularly when it falls under the inattentive type, because these,
Mhm.
particularly girls, so girls tend to be very quiet about this. And so if they're not doing well in school, they just tend to kind of withdraw, pull back, and go unnoticed. And they're um, very focused on not wanting to be noticed and not wanting anyone to point them out. They won't speak up in class. They may sit at the back of the classroom, and they just kind of get moved along and until things really start falling apart on them when they become teenagers. So for a long time, we heard that when a child was diagnosed, there was a point in time where people were told, "Oh, you'll grow out of it when you get into adulthood. Don't worry about it. You'll grow out of it." Well, I think people may develop compensatory strategies to
Mhm.
become more effective in managing this. But what I've discovered over 15 years in doing this is that I think we're dealing with something that we can call it something different and understand it better, which is if we really kind of think about the ADHD diagnosis in the current diagnostic criteria, almost anyone can qualify for it because there's a lot of debate about that diagnostic criteria. And there are a lot of folks saying, I think I could qualify. I could qualify. Everyone's saying, I think I could qualify for this. And to some degree, you probably could. So you kind of have both sides of the spectrum here, where I think people are going unnoticed, which isn't necessarily a good thing. And
Right.
then I think on the other side, you've got people, sometimes there's rewards for diagnosing children in certain school settings. And, it's just because they get funding for that. Other places don't want the diagnosis. So there's some good books out on that. I think I've referenced some of them in my book. Is if you want to delve deeper into any of this, a lot of things are referenced in my book to be able to help you go into those other other research topics and areas where they've talked about some of the policies that maybe are in existence that lead to or detract from accurate diagnosing. And that's why I think if we can just almost move away from this label of ADHD and create a different narrative about what we're dealing with, I think we solve some of that. Because I think if we can get to where I really think has happened, it's a little bit deeper issue than where we have been.
So I think it's a deeper issue in several ways. So number one, um, I'm just going to, in terms of school settings, the truth of the matter, school settings are set up, designed really ideally for girls. And so when you have an expectation that kids come in and they sit still and they focus and they pay attention to do the work, then that sets it up for boys to be overdiagnosed, because that's not how boys are. They're
Right.
rambunctious little guys who learn by touching and feel and
Yes.
doing, right? And so one of the things too that's also that occurs particularly with African American boys is that they get over categorized as being problematic in their
Yes.
behaviors, because the framework and the expectation is based upon girls.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
that's one element, and obviously we're not going to go into that, but I certainly wanted to bring that up as part of the conversation about hyperactive impulsivity, that girls and boys are different, and you shouldn't judge, have a standard that's based upon girls' behavior for boys when it doesn't fit. So
That is so true.
right.
Yes.
So there's that, but then there's also the dynamic too, that, as you well know, that when you have depression,
Mhm.
right? That depression, one of the components potentially is you have difficulty, paying attention. If you have, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, you can have problems paying attention. If you have anxiety disorders, then you can have problems paying attention. If you're having some kind of psychosis where you're hearing voices, or seeing things, or having some kind of stimulus that is also uh, diverting your attention, and so then you can be distracted and have problems paying attention or completing tasks, because your attention is being drawn inward to whatever the stimulus it is, that you're experiencing.
Absolutely. There's just so much that goes into this. And I think just this cursory review of just some behaviors probably leaves us a little short on really understanding what's happening with each person. And I'll wax just for a moment. My mother taught second grade in the same room for 32 years. So I kind of joke that I grew up in second grade, and I can remember her talking about, these little boys, she'd come home at night, and she wouldn't necessarily say their name, of course, but she'll say, I looked over and he was sitting on top of his desk. And then I looked over again and he's under his desk. And then he's writing from the side of his desk. And so, and here he was, he was fidgety. He couldn't sit still. So he was having a hard time of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I just always remember those stories, that I would hear about these second graders. And people are wired differently. And I think in those days, I give credit to my mom a little bit on that. I think she had maybe, and this, I'll say to this too, the classrooms were smaller. So if there were 20 students in a classroom, that was considered a large classroom of children. And now we can have up to 30 sometimes in these classrooms. So teachers have a lot of pressure on them in the classroom. And I taught for 25 years myself in academia in a university setting. So I'm familiar with that. Like I said, Mom was in the same classroom for 32 years. So she raised kids and then their kids.
Right. But and again, I just throw this in as part of the conversation. There's also, especially in the younger grades, a preponderance of women teachers,
Yes.
and
Yes.
so you start to see more men in the middle schools and definitely in high schools, which then of course brings a different dynamic, an improved dynamic, I think, as it relates to boys and their increasing testosterone. But again, when you have an overwhelming number of women, probably 90 something percent or more, women teaching at the lower grades, again, I just think we need to be moving towards the incorporation of more men teachers, to bring balance and understanding about men are from Mars and women are from Venus.
Yes.
As John Gray said.
did many years ago. And yes, children are the same. Little boys come from Mars, little girls come from Venus. And so when we have these behaviors that are problematic, I think it's so important that sometimes we if we can, kind of slow down and start trying to decipher what are these behaviors telling us. Because I think the behaviors actually are a language that if we could figure out how to decode it, instead of just trying to get rid of it, which tends to be, kind of the stopgap measure of a lot of things, is let's just get rid of the fidgety behavior and everything is going to be okay. Well, maybe not. Maybe that fidgety behavior is telling us something that this child's trying to communicate, and children can't describe this at all. Adults cannot describe this at all. It's just they know that something isn't working right. They know they're struggling more, and it often is internalized that there's something wrong with them. That I'm not smart, or I can't do this, and then you get this kind of learned helplessness sometimes that comes along. And boy, we want to nip that in the bud, because that doesn't help anyone grow up with that.
Yeah. So I love the fact that you're saying that their behavior is communicating to us a language that we need to decode. So before we go into that further, we're going to take a break, and then when we come back, we'll pick up with that. Heaven abounds in you, enlightens, uplifts, inspires, and invites you to live a life that's engaged, joyous, and limitless, the sweet spot of life. Take this journey in oneness. We are and have all that God, the infinite creative source of the universe, is. You are infinite potentiality, and the kingdom of heaven is within you. Heaven abounds in you.
Are you feeling stuck or in a holding pattern with your business or life, and you're not doing the things you want or love? Then at some point, you're going to be faced with a decision. You'll either choose to keep living in your comfort zone and risk a life of mediocrity, or increase your courage, step into your power, and forge into the unknown, where everything new becomes possible. If you're truly ready to live masterfully, then you need Ken D. Foster's newest book, The Courage to Change Everything: Strategies and Wisdom to Transform Your Life One Day at a Time. This powerful but simple guide provides you with 365 days of life-transforming wisdom, profound questions, and action steps that will increase your strength and open the doors to success. Stop wondering why your business or life isn't working. The answers are available now. Imagine if you had more courage or another chance to start following your dreams. To pick up your copy of The Courage to Change Everything, visit thecouragetochangeeverything.com. That's thecouragetochangeeverything.com.
Hi there. I am Dr. Durr, and I am back with my guest, Dr. Connie McReynolds, the author of Solving the ADHD Riddle. And before we went to break, we were talking about the fact that you said that you think that children's behavior is a language that we need to decode in order, one, to be able to give them the language to describe what they're experiencing, but also in order to solve the riddle.
Mm-hmm.
So
I do.
tell us more about that.
Sure. So I think, well, what I came to understand is that in my clinics, when people would walk in, there was this real urge to get rid of a behavior. It's like, well, these behaviors are just driving everyone kind of bonkers, if you will. Just kids were not doing well, parents were not doing well, teachers were not doing well. And there was just this drive to get rid of the behaviors. And what I started recognizing as I was doing this over the years is that these behaviors actually were telling us information. So, for example, that child who can't.
I was going to say, and let's be clear about this part, because I think it's important to keep in mind why you want to eliminate the behaviors. You want to eliminate the behaviors because in some ways it's causing academic failure, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's causing low or poor self-esteem as a consequence. And then the other part, and frustration for the child, frustration for the parents, frustrations for the teacher trying to teach. especially when the behaviors of the child are disruptive, right?
Exactly.
So that's why we want to quote unquote eliminate the behaviors.
Mm-hmm. Well, the goal is, yes, to get rid of that so that everyone can do well, because it's the perception is that it's the behaviors that are the problem. I think it's where I want to go with this, is that the behaviors are the problem. There are problematic behaviors, but if we change up how we're looking at this to investigative, and so if I become curious about what is a particular behavior telling me. For example, we might say that if my grandmother can't find her keys on a regular basis, we might say there might be memory problems going on. And there could be, or she could just be disorganized. So maybe she just can't remember where she did put things, but it might not be actually a memory thing. It could be that, well, maybe if we get rid of this pile and this pile and this pile, we'll find the keys down in between that pile. So again,
wait, there's a bunch of money down here with the keys too, Grandma.
Oh man, yes. Oh, there could be a lot going on there. So again, it's really about trying to figure out what the bigger picture is here. So with these children, what was happening is, as I was running these assessments and we were able to start pulling apart all this information, I found that these auditory and visual processing problems kind of fell along some behavioral pathways. So you could have auditory, you could have visual.
Yeah, and you're going to have to explain that, right?
I will. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
You didn't climb into the big word balcony, right?
Yeah. We're going in here with this one. So first, before we go too much further, I want to make sure I say that when we're dealing with visual processing, I'm not talking about visual acuity of sorts. So obviously I'm wearing some glasses, so I have a visual need to wear glasses, but that doesn't equate to the same thing as what I'm talking about with visual processing. And the same with auditory processing. It isn't the same thing as maybe needing a hearing aid or having hearing problems. I do think it's important to check both of those out at the front end of this, and I've recommended that parents do that if they haven't already done so. It's like we need to rule that out. So you got to rule out medical conditions.
Right. So you're saying with this particular potential cause of ADHD, it's not a problem that I can't see, right? Right. It's not a problem that I'm having trouble hearing.
Correct. Okay. Although I might get accused of not hearing well. So I might be accused of, it just goes in one ear and out the other. So I might be accused of not paying attention and tripping over things, but these are actually signals to us. So for example, this child who's constantly losing everything that they're setting down, they can't get the homework from home to school, they can't get the items from school to home, the backpack, you open it up and it just looks like paper exploded in there or something happened. And they lose things all the time. Well, that actually could be an indicator that this child has a visual processing component that's going on here. In the book, I have separate chapters. I have a chapter on auditory processing, and then I have a chapter on visual processing. And at the end of both of those chapters are checklists that could help parents and teachers really kind of figure out, gosh, am I dealing with an auditory processing problem here? Or am I dealing with a visual processing? So for auditory, we could say, I keep telling him over and over to go do this, this, and this when he gets home. And before he gets 3 steps away, he has completely forgotten everything. And then I'm repeating myself over and over and over again. Well, there could be an auditory processing problem there. There could be a problem with being able to retain what's being said, to hang on to it, in other words, to be able to put this into an actionable follow-through process, because some children can't do it.
All right, so Dr. Connie McReynolds, let's get a little real concrete here. Let's real specific. So when you say that they're having an auditory problem processing that instruction, What does
Mhm.
that mean specifically?
Mhm. So there's actually 37 areas that I look at with this computer-based assessment that we've been using for quite a long time. And part of what it looks at is something called auditory vigilance. And part of that is this person easily distracted? So do they kind of drift off? Do they tune out? And when that happens, are they able to get back on track? There's also an auditory focus component to this. It's like how much can they pay attention to what I'm saying to them? So if I'm giving instructions, are they focused or are they again tuning out, drifting off? There's another piece that's really important for people to understand, and it's called processing speed. And this is where a lot of children, I think, get caught because they get channeled into services because of slow processing speed, because this processing speed actually, I think, gets diagnosed as being more of an intellectual challenge. And so we'll actually hear terms such, and you don't hear it quite as much as you used to, but slow learner. Well, if I have a slow processing speed, I could easily get categorized as being a slow learner, which my intelligence could be average or above. I've worked with kids that are brilliant, but they're in special education because they can't keep up the pace. So they can't keep up with what's being presented to them. They lose track of all of this, and then it doesn't do well for them in school because it ends up being a situation where they aren't able to follow through. And then that general education setting doesn't look like it's supporting them in their educational process. So they get moved into these other more supportive circumstances.
Right. And I
And
think
just,
you know what, I think it's important to acknowledge that difference and that it's not necessarily one of intellect. Because, you know, I
mhm,
remember it's probably been 20 years or more now, um, that one of my friends, he said to me, and he's, you know, a pretty bright individual himself. And he said to me, he said, Balin, you idle faster than some people can run.
mhm,
And some of the women in my family talking about how sometimes certain men would make the comment, about them needing time to process things that
mhm,
we would say.
mhm,
Um, so I'm not necessarily saying that it is a male, female, or gender issue, but people do process things at different speeds, and
mhm,
it's not necessarily that one person is smarter or not than
right.
the other. It's just the way that their brain works. And
Mhm,
I want you to to finish talking about this too, because we were talking
mhm,
about we got to get into the visual part of this, but we're definitely going to need to circle back and make sure
mhm,
that we talk about um, that the problems paying attention or being hyperactive, impulsive, again, is just how the brain works, excuse me, or works differently, but it's not an issue of intellect. So I'm sorry, you were saying that
mhm,
in terms of the processing, the processing
mhm,
speed.
mhm. Well, and there was a case in point is in my book in one of the chapters about this teenage boy who'd been in special services since early on in elementary school and was in high school now. And he was sitting in the library and he was bored out of his skull as a teenage boy and really decided, I don't like my grade. I think I'm going
Mhm.
to hack the school's computer system to change my grade.
Idle
And he
hands,
did.
idle hands is the devil's workshop.
And he hacked it.
Uh-huh.
And this was the first indicator for anyone, including the parents, that, okay, what is going on here? This child got a lot more going on than anyone has ever felt like he's been able to demonstrate.
Right, he's a
And
lot
so
smarter, right? He's a lot smarter.
a lot smarter.
Mhm.
I would have no clue how to hack a school's computer system, but he did and did it quite readily. And sadly was expelled from that
Mm,
school
mhm.
because of that. Obviously, the parent brought him in to see us. We worked with him and then transferred to a new school for the next school year, and scored the highest on the state's math exam in the history of that school that next year. And it was because he simply couldn't process, he couldn't keep up with the lectures or the teacher in the classroom, and he would get distracted. So he wasn't really hyperactive. He was more the inattentive type, and he couldn't remember information that was given to him verbally. So some people who have the verbal or auditory processing can be very good with the visual.
That was the auditory processing problem.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
For him. And he actually had kind of a mixed bag for him. But what we were able to do is get that all strengthened up. And then the next year, of course, he went on and did very well. And he's gone on to college. And, he's living a different life now. Okay. The key is, can we figure out what's going on?
And hopefully he's not hacking some government site.
No. No. Thankfully, I think that was a one-time shot, kind of learned his lesson on that one.
He decided he was not going to pursue being a black hat, right?
Right. Right.
It's a black hacker instead of the white hat in terms of the hackers.
Right. That's right. That's right.
So what is
yeah.
So I was going to ask you, what does the visual processing difficulty look like?
So it's really interesting. Up on my website, I have a clip of a young man who was interviewed. He did neurofeedback. He wasn't one of our clients, but it's such a great example of him talking about what it was like for him to try to make his bed. Now, this is clearly an articulate young man. Mm-hmm. He's charming. He looks like he's got the world at his feet. And yet he's talking about that when he would go into his bedroom and have to change or make his bed, he would freeze there. He would just stare at it. He said, you would think that all you would have to do is take off the top covers, take off the sheets, put on the sheets and put on the top covers and be done with it. But he said he would stare at that and he would have no idea how to organize that. And it was such an overwhelming task that he could not do it. And I think that's such a great representation of what visual processing can look like, literally. This is the child who maybe you say pick up all the toys and they can't get that organized. They cannot visually organize their room. They can't visually organize their backpack. This may be the child who also bumps into things, trips over things, and again, get the vision checked to make sure they don't need glasses. But if that isn't the case, then this could be some signs, if you will, of visual processing problems. Messy handwriting is another one. In elementary schools, so if the handwriting is really messy, they can't form their letters, that could be a cue as well.
So then what's actually happening with the visual processing that they're unable to organize, making the bed, or or their handwriting is messy? What's actually happening?
So in my understanding of this, and I'll be the first to say I'm not a brain scientist here, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I am a rehab psychologist. Part of what I've come to understand with this is that the neuronal pathways that guide and help us with our auditory and our visual processing are just not strong enough. And that's with this assessment, I'm able to identify those areas. And sometimes it's this thing called visual prudence, where they're very easily distracted by visual things going on around them. Pardon me. They're distracted by visual things going on around them. So anything going by catches their distraction. They just can't focus. So the focus may be a problem. They can't get the information from the whiteboard down to a piece of paper. And when they try to, their lettering is just messy. They can't really organize. And that's part of the problem here, is that the organization skills are just missing for this particular child or adult.
So, so traditionally, the way we talk about, ADHD in medicine is that there is, parts of the brain that are working too slowly. And so because those parts of the brain are working too slowly, then they're not able to do the task, or meaning whether it's the focus and paying attention, it's just the organizing, the impulse control, right? Judgment. those things, those parts of the brain are not working fast enough. Therefore, they're not doing the job as well. And so obviously the intent behind giving medication is in order to help those parts of the brain to speed up. The same thing is true. Like there's some people that I know that have ADHD. They actually, because they're so revved up, that they have problem sleeping. So you would think, which is counterintuitive about somebody that has ADHD, that they need to take medication to speed up the brain so that it works more within the normal range to do things like even slow down enough to be able to sleep, or to again, to be able to focus, pay attention, control their impulses, etc. So that's the approach that we kind of conceptualize things of medically. But your approach is different. And I think one of the things that before we go on to this next part, I'd like for you to tell folks what a rehabilitation psychologist does, but also I think we should get into what are those I'll call them those mistaken beliefs that people have about ADHD, and what it says about the person, and also their expectations about what people can do. Because you're like, a lot of parents are like, well, like you said, he can focus on what he wants to do. He can play video games, but he can't clean up the room. So let's start with, what does a rehabilitation psychologist do?
Sure. So the beauty of the educational background that I had, I started out as a rehabilitation counselor many, many years ago. And part of what that was really geared toward is you have the diagnoses that you work with, but the process is really focusing on strengths-based activities. So it was really looking for things the person could do well. And I worked in employment settings and helping people get jobs and trainings and the like. And so it was more focused on, who is the person? It's not so much just the diagnostic label that might get them in the door for services, but then who is the person and what can we do to kind of work around? So it's always looking for a workaround. It's outside the box thinking. It's like, okay, if this doesn't work, which direction can we go? Can we do this? Can we do this? Can we do this? And it was really great because you really could get creative with finding solutions to help people. And with the rehab psychology, it's just an advanced level of that, where it was more of a psychology degree. So certainly I can do the diagnostic piece and that such. I have a private practice with talk therapy as well. And I taught for 25 years in the field of rehabilitation counseling. With that, I often taught students. I taught the psychiatric rehab, the addiction classes. And it was about really understanding, okay, this may be the diagnostic criteria that this person meets. But when they walk in the door, you really have to figure out who they are. And the key to this is finding the workaround, finding the ways that we can help them actually live their life, live their best life. And what can we do to facilitate that? So it was like walking in two different worlds. So they would have their abnormal psychology class, but then they would have the whole rehab action as well. And that's the background that I've brought to everything, to my teaching and to the clinics, which is, let's figure out what isn't working. Let's figure out what the strengths are, and let's see what we can do for those weaknesses. Can we actually mitigate some of that? And my process was using brain training, which I know we'll go into a little bit later, but it's training the brain. It's understanding that the brain is flexible, it can learn, and through repetition, and how we have learned everything that we've ever learned in our life is through repetition. From learning how to walk as a child, to drive a car, to ride a bike. And the good news is, once we kind of get that trained in the brain, it tends to hold, which is why this intervention of neurofeedback is attractive to people, because they can come in, and if we can figure out what that root cause is of these underlying behaviors and these conditions, and then we train the brain through about 20 hours of brain training, they don't need to come back. And I often say, well, how is that possible? It's like, well, did you learn how to ride a bike when you were a child? Well, yeah. I said, how long has it been since you've been on a bike? about 30 or 40 years. So if I brought a bike in here, do you think you could get on it and ride it? Well, yes. It's like, of course, because the brain holds on to that. And that's what this is about, is literally helping the brain hang on to and just reinforce better operant conditioning. So it's just using this very traditional operant conditioning, which is rewards. And there's a whole process we use for that to help people feel good about what they're doing and train the brain. And the key is, though, we can really dissect the behaviors. We understand those auditory and visual processing problems across those markers. And then by helping them strengthen those neuronal pathways, they can do better. Some people do great with medications. So, I want to speak to that, because obviously I have not treated every person on the planet who has struggled with this. So I've only dealt with those who've walked in my door. And so that's my data set, are the folks that I've directly worked with. And for them, when they show up, it's because these other things haven't worked for them. And so what they're looking for is a solution that hasn't been offered yet, or they haven't found that has a lasting effect for them. So some of those medications work great for people. I mean, obviously, we have millions of people who are on that, and it seems to be helping a lot of people. There seems to be this segment, though, that for some reason, it doesn't. And what I've come to understand is I think it's because we're actually dealing with maybe these auditory and visual processing problems for these folks.
Right. And the other thing too, I thought it was really important to have this conversation with you, is because there are obviously some people that the medication doesn't work. Two, it makes some of their symptoms worse. Three, they experience side effects. And four, sometimes they don't and they don't want to take medication. They may not even want to take medication at all. And then if they do take medications for the reasons I just spoke of, then if they took it before, now they don't want to take medication. And the third option, obviously, is for some folks, the optimal treatment will be medication and this other non-medication options. So, and so, I knew this is such a rich conversation that the folks are gonna have to stay tuned for part 2, right?
I think so.
Because we're just starting to stir the stew, right?
Right.
We just started to stir the stew, and and just so you know, actually, I was on a bicycle this year, so.
Perfect.
Right. So at least it hasn't been that long since I've been on bicycle. But now if you ask me about jumping rope, well, that's more like the 30 years ago. So we're going to ask the audience that you guys are going to have to come back for part 2, so that we can get into the other parts of this, in terms of what are those thoughts and barriers that people falsely believe about what ADHD is, that they think that falsely what it means about you as a person and your value and your worth. And then we can get more deeply into the work that Dr. McReynolds does, because based upon her research, it is a very viable and very practical, treatment option for those who may not want to take medications, or may want to augment the medication with something else. So I'm Dr. Durr. I'm glad you were able to join us for part 1 as we talk about, ADHD, what it looks like, and then obviously Dr. McReynolds' alternative treatment, where she's talking about the difficulties with processing that maybe actually be the causes and then the solutions for that. So we want you to stay with us and come back for part 2. You do not want to miss this. And we're going to talk about things again, those kind of mistaken thoughts and beliefs that people have about what ADHD is. And then we're going to go ahead and dive in and unpack those treatment options that Dr. McReynolds has offered and been very successful with us. I'm Dr. Durr, awakening and empowering you to live out your infinite potential, to live life in the sweet spot. Thank you for joining us today in the sweet spot. Share, follow, and like us on social media. To learn more, please visit balinadurrmd.com, spelled BALINADURRMD.com. Join us next week, and remember, when you heal your mind, all things are possible.